Hello chess lovers and welcome to Chess Insight! In today's video, we're going to study an aggressive and deadly gambit opening that black can use. This opening can be played as a response to white's first move, whether they begin with the pawn to e4 or the pawn to d4. Let's start with the first move. White pushes the pawn to e4. As black, we respond with the pawn to d6, which is the perk defense. In this position, most white players will advance the pawn to d4, taking control of the central squares with both pawns. Now, usually in the perk defense, black would develop the knight to f6. But in this trap, we choose a different variation. That's right, we push the pawn to e5, immediately putting pressure on white's central pawn. Since the pawn is being attacked, most white players will capture it, hoping that black will capture back with the pawn. The idea behind this is to exchange queens early, which would prevent black's king from castling. However, after white captures the pawn, we're going to continue with a gambit, sacrificing yet another pawn. We bring out the knight to c6, allowing white to take the pawn on d6. Players who are unfamiliar with this trap will almost always be tempted to capture that pawn. But by doing so, they give black the chance to recapture with tempo, while at the same time developing the bishop. At move 5, white often develops the knight to f3. And if that happens, we immediately go for an aggressive move, the bishop to g4, pinning the knight against white's queen. Typically, white responds by playing the bishop to e2, breaking the pin. Next, we place the queen on e7. This not only puts pressure on the pawn at e4, but also clears the way for black to castle long. At this point, black already has several active pieces, while white's position looks much more defensive. This is exactly the reward we get from sacrificing that one pawn earlier. Notice that the pawn on e4 is now under attack from black's queen. The most logical move for white is to defend it with the knight to c3. After white develops the knight, we can castle queenside. Now, black's rook indirectly lines up against white's queen. If white makes a mistake here, for example, if they rush to castle, then black can capture the knight with the bishop. After white recaptures with the bishop, black's bishop can take the pawn on h2 with check, simultaneously opening up a rook attack on white's queen. That queen will surely be lost in the next move. So after black castles long, white must prevent this possible discovered attack by the rook. The most natural way to do that is to play the bishop to d2, and in fact, database statistics show this is the most common choice for white. From there, we exchange our bishop for the knight on f3. Once white recaptures with the bishop, we then place our bishop on f4. Now you can see that both our bishop and rook are targeting white's dark-squared bishop. That bishop is guaranteed to fall on the next move. If white tries to block the d-file with the knight to d5, attacking both the queen and bishop at the same time, it doesn't work. Black can simply capture the knight with the rook. The pawn on e4 can't recapture the rook because it's pinned by the queen. With such an advantage, winning the game becomes much easier for black. Let's backtrack a bit. In the beginning, we looked at what happens if white accepts the gambit with pawn takes pawn. Now let's see what happens if white declines and instead develops the knight to f3. In this case, our first step is still to bring out the bishop to g4, pinning the knight against white's queen. Notice here, the pawn on d4 is being threatened, and the knight on f3 is pinned. White is very likely to be tempted to capture the pawn on e5, and if white does take with the pawn, we continue by developing the knight to c6. Then, after white captures on d6, we recapture with the bishop. Earlier, we saw white's typical response of bishop to e2. But now let's look at another option, bishop to d3. Just like before, we place the queen on e7, preparing to castle long. If white castles short, we castle long, moving to the opposite side. From this position, white has two common options, the pawn to h3 or the knight to c3. If white pushes the pawn to h3, we reply with the pawn to h5, deliberately allowing white to capture our bishop on g4. But if white dares to capture the bishop, then our pawn captures back, attacking the knight on f3. The only good square for that knight is g5, because if the knight retreats, say to d2, Then black can sacrifice the rook on h1 with check. White is forced to capture with the king, and then the queen jumps to h4 with another check. Soon after, white will be checkmated with queen to h2. Therefore, the best option for white is the knight to g5. From here, we develop our knight to f6, preventing white's queen from taking the pawn on g4. Notice now how our rook and bishop are both pointing directly at white's king side. White has no choice but to ease the pressure by pushing the pawn to g3. If white plays g3, then we immediately swing the rook to h5, putting pressure on the knight at g5. This move also prepares us to double rooks on the h-file. If white now plays bishop to e2, attacking the pawn on g4, we defend it with the knight to e5. And as you can see, black has so many different attacking ideas in this position. Even though black has sacrificed a bishop, the remaining pieces are extremely active and concentrated against white's king side. Eventually, black can double rooks on the h-file, creating deadly threats. Let's rewind again. What if, after black castles, white plays the knight to c3? We respond with the knight to e5, adding more pressure to the knight on f3. This creates a very difficult situation for white. If white's bishop retreats to protect the knight, that actually turns into a fatal mistake, because black has the powerful sequence knight takes knight with check. After white recaptures with the bishop, black's bishop captures the pawn with check. White's queen will be lost to black's rook shortly after. Let's step back again. After black's knight moves to c6, what if white doesn't capture the pawn, but instead develops the bishop to b5, trying to pin the knight? In this case, black should simply respond with pawn takes pawn. And even if white exchanges queens, it's not a serious issue since black can recapture with the rook. For example, if white's bishop takes the knight, black's pawn captures back. Even though black's pawn structure looks damaged, the position remains balanced. Both players have equal chances to fight for the win. But less careful white players often make the mistake of thinking that the pawn on e5 is free. The most common blunder is knight takes pawn. But if white dares to grab that pawn, then black can immediately deliver checkmate with rook to d1. Now let's go back again. What if white's first move was the pawn to d4? Here, we can build a pattern very similar to what we've already seen. First, we push the pawn to e5, inviting white to capture. Once white takes the pawn, we again sacrifice with the pawn to d6. Usually, white captures once more, trying to increase their pawn advantage. Then we develop with tempo by capturing back with our bishop. In this position, white's most common move is to develop the knight to f3. If that happens, we bring our knight to c6. This is a key pattern you must remember when playing this gambit. The only difference in this variation is that white's pawn on the e-file hasn't been pushed yet. So now white has the option to advance it to e3 or straight to e4. But whichever square it goes to, it doesn't really change black's plan. The idea is always the same. Bring the bishop to g4, then the queen to e7, followed by castling long. Let's take the example where white plays pawn to e3. Just as before, we bring out the bishop to g4, pinning the knight. Typically, white will respond with bishop to e2. We answer with queen to e7. If white castles short, then we castle long, preparing for a discovered attack in the next moves. White needs to stop this threat, and usually they try with bishop to d2. Then we continue with knight to f6. If white tries to chase our bishop with the pawn to h3, we respond with h5, willingly sacrificing our bishop on g4. But once again, if white captures it, black recaptures with the pawn, opening up the h-file for the rook to directly target white's king, supported by the bishop on d6. At the same time, white's knight is under attack. If white tries to save it by jumping to d4, we don't capture immediately. Instead, we first give check with the bishop to h2. After the king moves to h1, then we capture the knight. When white recaptures with the pawn, we continue with rook takes pawn, pinning the bishop against white's queen. Later, black can unleash discovered checks while piling more pressure on white's dark-squared bishop. Another strong plan is queen to e5, preparing to maneuver to h5, and again white will find themselves in serious trouble. With such an advantage, black is very likely to win easily. Let's back up a few moves again. Earlier we saw that capturing the bishop on g4 is disastrous for white, but what if instead white develops the knight to c3? In this case, black can immediately exchange the bishop for the knight on f3. After white recaptures with the bishop, we bring our queen to e5, directly threatening checkmate on h2. The only way to stop this checkmate is for white to push the pawn to g3. Then black continues with h4, attacking white's pawn. Here, white's most common mistake is to defend the pawn with the knight to e2, but black can still capture the pawn on g3. If white recaptures with the pawn, we place the bishop on c5. Now the pawn on h3 is threatened by the rook, while the pawn on e3 is pressured by both the queen and the dark-squared bishop. With so much attacking force coming from black's pieces, it becomes nearly impossible for white to hold on. Alright, chess lovers, that's the aggressive gambit opening you can try when playing as black. Hopefully this video gives you new insight into the game of chess. That's all for today's discussion. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you again in the next chess video.